Hi, everyone. My name is Joseph Salahi Chung. Thank you for being here for our presentation on anti-racism in child welfare. We'll leave a few minutes at the end of the session for attendees to ask questions, so feel free to put questions in the chat if you joined us on Zoom, or to use index cards here in person. In this presentation, we'll cover the history of systemic separation of Black children from their parents and the problem of racial disproportionality and disparities in the child welfare system. After that, we will summarize key components of the frameworks that guide our studies. Then present 3 studies we conducted or are finishing in the next few months. For each study, we will introduce the guiding questions, briefly present our research methods, and share the findings and subsequent recommendations generated by each project. We'll start with some background information. The background of the current work to address racism and racial bias stems from the history of separating Black families in the US, starting with enslavement moving through the carceral state and child protection as examples. On the slide, we see a newspaper ad from the mid-1800s. A son was searching for his mother after having been sold as property, separately from one another. Such ads were common following the Civil War, as Black families tried to reunite following the abolition of legal enslavement. Fast forward to today, and our efforts to address how racial bias contributes to the disproportionate separation of Black families in the child welfare system. Data released in 2021 from the California Child Welfare Indicators Project shows that in Los Angeles County, Black children are removed at a rate almost 4 times their share of the population. This means that while 7.6% of children in Los Angeles County are Black, they make up 27.2% of all detentions and removals, so a difference of approximately 2 out of 25 versus 7 out of 25. It is important to note that racial disproportionality and racial disparities are not limited to out-of-home placements. Disparate outcomes exist for Black families and children throughout various intercepts along the continuum of contact with the child welfare system. These include, but are not limited to, a disproportionate number of reports, a disproportionate number of substantiations, and a disproportionate number of removals. The system is not successful in creating stability for children in foster care, and that is reflected by greater placement instability, longer length of stay within the system, lower likelihood of achieving permanency, and an overrepresentation of Black youth aging out of foster care. I'll now summarize a couple of frameworks that guide our studies. Structural intersectionality highlights how social inequalities are shaped by the convergence of multiple intersecting systems of oppression, such as structural racism and economic inequity. Structural intersectionality emphasizes that social inequalities are not caused by individual social statuses or identities, but instead stem from systems of oppression involving asymmetrical power relations. Our work is also informed by Ibram Kendi's anti-racism framework. Anti-racism is the practice of actively and persistently identifying, opposing, and dismantling racism. The goal of anti-racism is to actively change or eliminate policies, practices, behaviors, systems, structures, and beliefs that perpetuate racist ideas and actions. Kendi states that anti-racism operates in direct opposition to racism. He asserts that inaction in the face of racism is, in fact, a form of racism, and that silence or indifference are also forms of racism. An anti-racism stance operates from the idea that there is no such thing as an innocent bystander when it comes to racism. Instead, there's only racism and anti-racism. We look to examine our work in alignment with the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors Anti-Racism Diversity Initiative. which states its commitment to examine structural racism and its consequences in Los Angeles County. Next, my colleagues will present 3 UCLA Pritzker Center studies on race.
Okay. Thank you, Joseph. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura, and I will be presenting on one of the studies on race we have done here at the Pritzker Center. We usually refer to this specific study as the barrier study because of its focus on identifying the barriers that exist within the child welfare system that prevent us from reducing racial disproportionality within child welfare. Our guiding question was, what are the barriers to implementing practices and policies that reduce Black racial disproportionality in LA County child welfare? For our methodology, our data collection and analysis proceeded in 3 ways. First, we did a document analysis to familiarize ourselves with the literature on the issue and efforts that exist to prevent or reduce racial disproportionality within child welfare. Second, we utilized geographic information systems to develop a spatial understanding and visual representation of where Black, Latinx, and Indigenous children in LA County child welfare system live. Then we did qualitative data collection using focus groups and interviews to explore the perspectives of key informants from DCFS and other child serving systems and social workers providing direct services in LA County on barriers to reducing or preventing racial disproportionality. Our analysis resulted in 6 themes. The first one was carceral entanglement, which refers to the ways in which previous interactions with the criminal legal system perpetuate the removal of children within their families. Our second theme was problematic policies that includes issues such as the broad definition of general neglect, which can be used against Black families, mandated reporting biases, and paternal families and the father being left out of the reunification process. Our third theme identified from our data collection was leadership-related issues that acted as barriers, and these ones include performative anti-racism leadership, a lack of a strategic leadership and role clarity, frequent leadership transitions, and overworked professionals within the system. Our fourth theme, called system gridlock, refers to a lack of cooperation between county departments or institutions and the siloing that exists within the systems. Our sixth theme, funding or lack thereof, to fund new initiatives or policies that would be effective in combating the barriers to reduce racial disproportionality within the system. Lastly, our sixth theme is confronting and conversing about race and racism, which involves issues of actively denying or avoiding conversations about race and racism. Based on the themes that were identified from the data collection, we wrote the recommendations that fall within 3 pillars. The first pillar, called Recognizing Structural Intersectionality and Addressing Structural Racism, includes recommendations to remove policies and practices that continue to criminalize families. For example, having previous arrest counting as an added risk factor in structural decision-making. Also, reassessing LA County's definition and use of general neglect, and the mandated reporting guidelines. Another recommendation within this first theme, or the recommendation pillar, is to redirect funding from more families to stay together. Fourth one is intentional and meaningful involvement with fathers and paternal family members in intervention strategies. And the fifth one from this first recommendation pillar is to examine the role and complexities of domestic violence. Our second recommendation pillar, called Workforce Development, Practical and Ongoing Training in Racial Bias and Structural Competency Across Child Serving Systems, has 2 recommendations. The first one, implement critical and sustained training in implicit bias, anti-racism for staff and executive leadership in child serving systems. And the second one, integrate structural competency training for students in the Bachelor of Social Welfare and MSW trainees. Our third recommendation pillar was transformational leadership and culturally responsive trauma and healing-informed organizational culture. This one included recommendations on appoint and support transformational sustained leadership, build a no-shame culture and enhance feelings of psychological safety, and name anti-racism as a North Star. So thank you. I will now pass it on to America, who will talk about another study on race that we have done here at the Pritzker Center.
Thank you, Lara. Hello, everyone. My name is America Ramirez. The second study we will be discussing is Courageous Conversations. Before I begin, we wish to thank our generous funders, the Foster Together Network and the Pritzker Foster Care Initiative. This study was designed to explore and increase understanding of experiences, attitudes, and perceptions, all related to our 4 key objectives: providing care for Black youth in foster care, facilitating reunification among Black families, receiving foster care services as a Black youth or family, and training and support needed among caregivers caring for Black youth. Moving on to methodology, as part of the data collection, 15 focus groups and 2 individual interviews were conducted within 4 participatory groups: non-Black group home staff, non-Black resource parents, Black youth in care, and parents of Black youth in care. A grand total of 51 participants interviewed or participated in focus groups via Zoom, while simultaneously being audio recorded with their consent. Our populations of interest were recruited through spreading out flyers to various organizations that work within the foster care system. These interviews were based on a set of questions all related to the experiences of being or caring for Black youth in foster care and facilitated by a licensed clinical psychologist. Participants were also asked to keep race in mind when answering their questions. As far as the analysis goes, data was qualitatively analyzed through a thematic and systemic approach. Audio recordings of the interviews and focus groups were transcribed using the program Otter. Transcripts were then cleaned, then uploaded into Deduce, a software used for qualitative analysis, also known as coding. The coding process allowed the research team to identify general themes and trends that emerged across the data, and resulted in 1,823 excerpts and quotes from the participants. Commonalities and differences in the participants' perspectives concerning the 4 project objectives were found, and our findings were turned into the report you all may find on the Pritzker Center website. Our findings are separated into 3 parts. Part 1, providing and receiving care, focuses on key objectives 1 and 3. Because of the bidirectional nature of caregiving, they've been combined. With some exception, the section on caregivers and staff outlines data providing care, where the section on parents/relatives and youth outline data on receiving care. Numerous non-Black caregivers stated that they were not asked on their racial preference for the youth placed in their care, but those who were asked overall stated that they opted out of having a Black youth placed in their care due to lack of preparation. Non-Black STRTP staff noted that they were aware that race plays a critical role in their work caring for their youth. Moving on to receiving care, Black youth stated that their race didn't play a part in the care they received, but when asked to further elaborate on such experiences, racial issues were discovered. They also had a general idea that Black foster youth are set up for failure and are then treated as such. Part 2, facilitating reunification among Black families, focuses on our second objective. Non-Black caregivers overall stated that the way they approach reunification with biological families was dependent on how their social workers approach reunifications, thus their responses varied. Non-Black STRTP staff shared overall insights on reunification that were generally applicable to all youth irrespective of race. Black parents and relatives overwhelmingly felt unsupported by the system due to mistreatment, disrespect, and judgment by professionals in the foster care system. Black youth wished to incentivize reunification with their biological families. Our last part, Part 3, training and support needed, reflects our 4th and final key objective. Non-Black caregivers called for better education on how to care for Black youth, especially cultural specific training and how to better connect with the Black youth in their care. Non-Black STRTP staff wished for resources that promoted independent living skills for youth currently in foster care and those that have aged out. Black parents and relatives described an absence of mental health services available for Black youth, and then a lack of services that are both culturally responsive and beneficial for supporting biological parents. Finally, Black youth wish for resources for them after they leave foster care and for more while during care, like housing options. Here are 8 recommendations that came from the focus groups and interviews. They've been piled into 3 overall categories. The ones highlighted in yellow will be discussed further. In the education category, recommendations 1 and 2 are included. For recommendation 1, require hair and skin education, was something that all 4 participant groups called for. Like all youth, appearances matter, and many Black youth stated that they often felt as if their requests for hair and skincare products were continuously overlooked. Issues such as hygiene, skin, and hair care racially, and cultural realities all matter when it comes to the wellness and survival of Black youth. The funding category includes recommendations 3 and 4. Recommendation 4, provide additional resources. Those resources include post-foster care resources for aging out foster youth, for example, college admission resources. Our last category is advocacy, which includes recommendations 5 through 8. Recommendation 5, make reunification a priority. And recommendation 8, strengthen advocacy for biological parents. Both speak to enhancing attention to reunification, the role of racism in failing to achieve it, and the unique needs of Black families that must be addressed. Parent advocacy and support must be improved, and greater efforts must be made to connect them with resources, informing them of their rights, and assist them with reunification, and seek to provide ongoing connection with their children when it's safe and appropriate. Thank you. I will now pass it to Sophia.
Thank you, Marika. Hi, everyone. My name is Sophia D'Souza, and I'm going to be presenting on the DCFS blind removals pilot study. Blind removals is an exploratory practice to reduce racial bias in decision-making when investigating reports of alleged child abuse and neglect. The aim of this study was to understand DCFS social workers' experiences, attitudes, and perceptions of racial disproportionality and racial bias within the child welfare system, with a specific focus on blind removal as a strategy to reduce racial disproportionality within DCFS. For the study, 18 focus groups were conducted via Zoom. 6 of them were from the West LA DCFS office and 12 of them from the Compton-Carson DCFS office. These were conducted to engage in dialogue about racial bias and disproportionality and blind removal as a tool for decision-making. Data from each office was collected and analyzed separately using deduce, and a conceptual framework of white supremacy culture and race evasiveness was used. Race evasiveness is defined as the avoidance of conversation about race. White supremacy culture refers to the practice of utilizing whiteness as a standard by which all other groups are judged, and explores how white supremacy permeates all systems in the US. Four characteristics we drew upon include defensiveness, fear of open conflict, avoidance of discomfort, and sense of urgency. From these focus groups, we came to 3 main findings. The first theme in our findings is fragmented efforts. So this theme suggests differing understanding of views of blind removals as a strategy to interrupt bias and reduce racial disproportionality within the 2 offices and some differences between offices. Within this theme, fragmentation was identified in 3 main areas. The first area is staff understanding of racial disproportionality. The second area is staff knowledge of department efforts to reduce racial disproportionality. And the final area is the department's implementation of strategies to address racial bias and reduce disproportionality. Our second theme is inadequate system accountability. Findings from this theme arise from focus group data from the West LA office and the Compton-Carson offices. So these focus groups mentioned that social workers felt a personal responsibility to manage their own biases and check themselves in conversations and in their written work, and they deflected responsibility onto other systems in doing so. These other systems include education, law enforcement, mental health, mandated reporting, etc. Data from both offices suggest how staff use critical analysis to situate experiences with Black families in the context of over-surveillance, and how that erodes trust and engagement within this work. Application of critical analysis varied between the 2 offices and between focus group participants. Our final theme is perceptions of urgency. Within this theme, focus group participants from both offices expressed being motivated by a sense of urgency in their work to properly connect with and assess families' risk and protective factors to complete this work in a 30-day timeframe. Participants viewed time as both a barrier and a resource for decision-making. Additionally, supervisors and assistant regional managers aim to ensure that social workers and supervisors felt supported in their work by being available around the clock. Something important to note about perceptions of urgency is that it can be a hallmark of white supremacy culture characterized by difficulty making time for inclusivity. From these findings, we have put together some recommendations. The 5 that we will be speaking about are listed on the slide. I'll talk about them a little bit further. So the first one is to connect implicit bias training content to other departmental efforts. Our second recommendation is to talk about race, racial bias, and disproportionality on a regular basis. Creating this conversation is really what is going to lead to collaboration, which we will be talking about further. Our third recommendation is to identify champions for anti-racist practice to support talking about race, racial bias, and disproportionality across department settings. Our fourth recommendation is to convene conversations about how to reconcile child and family safety with efforts to address racial bias and reduce disproportionality. Our final recommendation is to assess current strategies and develop an integrated anti-racist organizational action plan. I'll now pass it to Joseph for our concluding notes.
Thank you, Laura, America, and Sophia, for wonderfully presenting our projects related to anti-racism and child welfare. We want to re-emphasize a couple of key points for you to take away from this presentation. One being the need for conversations on race and racism within DCFS. To address racial disproportionality and bias faced by Black children, youth, and parents, it is crucial that these conversations take place. In addition, we provided recommendations for improving the wellness of Black children and youth, like requiring hair and skin education for non-Black caregivers and staff. All of these anti-racism efforts can be supported by staff and leadership cultivating a workplace environment that creates an open space for conversations on race and racism. In addition, we identified the need for the development of policies and practices aimed at creating systemic change. Such policies and practices would ideally improve cooperation between county departments and institutions as they strive towards reducing racial disproportionality in Los Angeles County. By utilizing policies and practices to implement a no-shame culture, workers can feel supported in their journeys towards approaching their day-to-day work with an anti-racism stance. Finally, while these conversations may be difficult, they are absolutely necessary, and growth in this area may allow DCFS to create a united front against racism and tackle racial disproportionality in unprecedented ways. Thank you all. We would now like to welcome any questions that you have for the team.
I see that.
Feel free to put questions in the chat, and we actually have one. Thank you, Stephanie. Stephanie said, your findings present a wide variety of policies and practices for DCFS and foster care agencies. Is the Pritzker Center planning to work with these agencies to implement your recommended changes? This is an excellent question. And I would say, I'll open this to other folks too, but from my perspective, our projects that we will present in right after the lunch break around domestic violence and child welfare start to get at supporting change in practice and policy within DCFS, specifically related to child welfare and domestic violence, which was one of the key recommendations in the barrier study. And it also focuses on serving Black families well when these two systems intersect, child welfare and domestic violence. So that is one example, and I'll open it to other folks to respond.
Yeah, I would say that that's been our goal all along. At this point, we see it as a phased process, if you will. And so we needed to, we were asked to be at the table with county to try to bring some of the data and studies, make the recommendations, and then the hope is that there will be motions put forward that will enable us to sort of put the, to get on the ground and actually make a difference in the lives of kids and families and systems, right? So I'll let you add to our.
Yeah, I'm gonna always stir up the pot a little bit. So I'm gonna complicate it because I agree with Dr. Langley. I think we have always viewed ourselves as being part of the solution, working with DCFS, trying to help them facilitate and figure out ways that we can begin to address some of the issues that you all wonderfully addressed. However, there's another school of thought that says this is a system that cannot be fixed.
Right.
This is a system that is broken, or some would say it's doing what it was designed to do in the first place, which is to tear apart families and keep them away, keep children away from their families. So there's this big, I'm sure many of you have heard about it, this move towards, abolition. How do you completely eradicate the system and think of something different? We've had internal conversations about that, about, kind of how do we position ourselves? Some people think if you're working with DCFS, then you're working within a broken system, or you have to work outside of DCFS and try to imagine something different. I think we've been able to nimbly try to figure out how do you kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. We still have families that are in the system that we have to figure out how to support, but you also have to be a part of other conversations that says perhaps this system is not working. And so I think it's a complicated situation that I think we need bright minds like the folks around this table to help us figure out how it all comes together.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, for your question. We have time for more. Okay, so we have another question from Candace, who had to join late, which is fine. I was wondering if you are also partnering, incorporating LA County's DHS hub clinics as part of this work / educational initiatives for the foster care medical providers and staff. And I will gladly turn that over to Mia and Brittany, who will be discussing this in detail in the next presentation, but you can give a preview.
Advertiser.
Perfect segue. Candace gave us a good segue there.
Definitely. Yeah, I'll start and then we can go. Yeah, we work with Dr. Lisa Gansup at the High Desert Regional Health Center Hub Clinic in the Antelope Valley, and she's our AV Child and Wellbeing Fellow for the Pritzker Center. And so we worked with her on a few different initiatives that she wants to work on. We've done like a social media outreach for transition age youth, and then she also provides education to her fellow pediatricians at the High Desert Hub as well, and then spotlight series for community organizations that want to work with the hub and giving education to those folks as well. But yeah,
and you'll definitely hear more about it in the next presentation actually, but we do really try to incorporate Dr. Lisa Gans, what she really tries to do is provide trauma-informed care to the medical hub providers and other community organizations. And we do this through a lot of collaborative efforts. Again, you'll hear it in a few minutes actually, but yeah.
Great, thank you. We have one more question, and that is from Jen Chow. She says, thank you for all of the presentations. I have a question about the potential challenges that may arise during the implementation of a no-shame culture in DCFS. What obstacles do you anticipate in this regard? In an ideal scenario, what kind of support should be established to facilitate this effort?
Karen's looking. Okay. So I think that one of the biggest challenges around the no shame culture implementation is actually the idea that these issues don't exist in the first place. That families in general, they're harming their kids, they should be called about, they should be brought into the system, and that they're there legitimately. And there's sort of like a denial of racism, racial bias. And I think confronting that has been really eye-opening as well as really challenging, because despite all of the evidence, there's still some sentiment that they're just doing their jobs and that this is just how it is. So I think that that's the one side of the coin, is really admitting that these issues do exist and that we need to talk more openly about them in order to confront them. I think on the other hand, folks in this work have oftentimes been doing this work for many years and coming at it with a child safety perspective. And that makes change challenging as well, because they see it not necessarily about race, but about safety. And helping folks better understand that these issues blend and that they go together, I think is equally challenging when it comes to really talking about these issues and implementing this idea of reduction or different conversations about how to support families. Those are a few thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts, exactly what you said, and the other pieces around work that we're already doing to shift the idea of mandated reporting to community supporting. And that I think will go a long way because it's a cover your ass mentality. It's a fear of liability. And the other piece to that I think is critical is we can't really change the narrative unless we address the fact that child welfare imparts harm. And there's this assumed benevolence, right? With the idea of like, oh, we're just doing good, and nobody actually is naming the fact that it's also harmful. So many times people are thinking, well, I better go ahead and report because I don't want to lose my license, or I want the, whatever my profession is, I don't want it to be impeded. And mandated reporting, like the number of categories are just spreading in terms of who's a mandated reporter. So I think being able to name that it's not just like, well, won't do any harm, might help. And we really have to shift that narrative around the fact that we know all the harms that are imparted when people become system involved. And so addressing harm, thinking about surveillance, and I think naming the reality, I think will shift some of the conversation. The psychological safety though can't come until we have the policy, right? Like the liability and immunity has to be in place too.
Yeah, and if I can build on that, I think these are excellent points. I think that narrative shifts when you begin to provide data that shows that the number of unsubstantiated cases that don't rise to the level, especially with educators. I think if you have so-called mandated reporters, they actually solve the harm that happens. You took what happens with a single child when a report happens, and the kinds of surveillance and investigation and the ways in which the psychological and emotional trauma that's inflicted upon a family can be devastating. And so I think that oftentimes for many reporters, they don't recognize what that call does. And I think the community supporter idea says, look, DCFS in many cases should be the last resort, not the first resort, especially when you're talking about issues of poverty, neglect, or that plague. But I think Dr. Lenny is so spot on. You've got to shift the narrative, but you shift the narrative by somehow getting rid of this idea. I know when I was in a teacher education program, they said, if you don't report, you can go to jail, you can lose your license. They scare you so much. You think, okay, well, if I see the smallest thing that seems out of the ordinary, I better call or else. The training has to be different. The data has to be shown, and seeing these accounts of what happens to children and families, I think would help to open people's eyes and ultimately shift the narrative.
Thank you all. So that wraps our first session, and we will take a 3-minute break and then resume with our session on the work that we're doing in the Antelope Valley. Thank you.